Hello, welcome back to my tech tip of building this certain type of slot car chassis. Still haven't given the name away. If you haven't seen the previous videos, then I'll put a link up here for you to have a look. And I want to hear your comments about what it's actually going to turn into. Well, I gave you some clues at the end of the last video, but here's all the pieces that I've cut out, ready to solder together. I haven't fixed anything together just yet. It's all just sitting in place here. And I was going to start by soldering together all the pieces that go into the center section. So I've moved my chassis block over to the left hand side. You can see why in a minute. And I've got this area here. But before I start, I'm going to show you what kind of things I'm going to be using. So I'm going to be using this rapid electronic solder. It's just normal electrician solder, 6040, 18 gauge, but you can get perhaps when you're learning, maybe you might want to go for a slightly thinner gauge of solder so you don't put too much on. But solder's quite expensive these days. You can get lead-free solder, but really it's not very good. It's not easy to solder with. So I'd recommend you getting the lead version if you can. I'm also going to be using some of this acid flux. Now this is Lucky Bob's Racing Acid Flux. I've had it quite a few years. You can see I'm finally getting down to the last bit in the bottle now, but I do have another one ready to go. And you can see I've got this little flux applicator here. It's really just a little makeup brush. I think they use it for fine makeup stuff. You can get them off of Amazon. I'll put a link down below where you can get these from. But things like maybe a toothpick or a cocktail stick or something like that would probably do the job. And it allows you to apply the flux very accurately in a very small amount of flux in a tiny area rather than brushing it on. These bottles do come with a brush in the head, but it didn't last very long, and you tend to put too much on with a little brush as well. It's better to just use a little sort of dabbing applicator like this in here. So you'll need yourself some acid flux and some solder. You'll also need yourself a soldering iron. Now this one's adjustable temperature soldering iron. It's got a digital control on the main soldering unit. I've got a decent sized tip in it. This is a 5mm chisel tip. And they're really good for getting into the various areas of soldering a chassis and motors into your car. They're also quite good heat capacity, so they build up a lot of heat in the tip and then you can apply that heat instantly. This is a 60-watt iron, which again, if you've got a decent enough tip, 60 watts is fine to solder most things. I mean, if you were going to solder a big heavy brass lump chassis, then you might want a slightly bigger soldering iron or even bigger tip. Or you might even heat your brass before you solder it. And if you get some heat in the brass, then it just makes it easier to solder together by applying a little bit more heat afterwards. But this is a 60-watt soldering iron and a decent size tip. So I've got these pieces in the front of my chassis already that they're dropped in place and they're going to sit there. I'm then going to use my little flux applicator to apply a little bit of flux around where they're actually going to solder in. So you can see I'm just putting it either side of the joint where they're going to solder in. Now I also want to be careful that I don't get solder inside this little hole in here, because this is going to be the inner pan hinge, so I don't want solder to go inside the hole. So I'm just going to be very careful where I'm applying the flux here. Sometimes it's inevitable that solder will run into that hole, but at this stage, and this is part of the reason why I'm doing this bit first, at this stage it's easy to get in and clean out that hole if something does happen to go inside. Now what the acid flux does is it helps the solder flow, it helps keep the joint clean in between the two bits, it stops it from oxidizing whilst you're soldering, and so it also helps the solder stick to the chassis. So move that out the way. I've got my soldering iron heated up to 140 degrees C. And I'm going to take my bit of solder here, get that ready to use. So my soldering iron is 140 degrees C. I've wiped the tip clean. Going to put a little bit of solder on the tip of the iron. And then I'm going to hold the iron underneath the chassis and I'm just going to heat it up like that. And then the solder will flow from the bottom of the chassis up through and around the part that I'm soldering in. There we go. Now I don't want too much solder on the iron this time for this bit. A little bit there. A little bit there. And there we go. So each piece soldered from underneath. It's also worth just checking that they're all in line, that they have actually settled down. Sometimes it can be worth just holding them down with the tip of a knife or something like that, just to make sure they're sitting fine, because if they're really small light bits, sometimes they move around when you solder. So I'm just going to wipe the end of the soldering iron and just show you how I might just hold them down like that whilst I heat up the solder joint, just to make sure they're sitting down nicely in the chassis. Now if I bring that up closely, you should be able to see that the solder's flowed nicely around all of those parts. Have I got any solder inside the holes? Let's have a look. Well, it might just be a bit of flux on this one. I don't know. Where are we going? There we are. It might just be a little bit of flux sitting in that hole. I'll have to check by just putting a bit of wire in there and making sure it's clear. But you can see it's flowed nicely around all those joints. And I'm going to be cleaning them up a little bit later. Not too long, because I don't want it to rust away. But before I go and wash the chassis, I'm going to start putting some of the other bits in the chassis and soldering them in a similar way. So when I'm doing this guide tab spacer here, I need to make sure that it's covered in solder, both faces, just to make sure that I get a really good solder joint. Some people rely on the solder being drawn into the joint, and that generally works most of the time, but sometimes it doesn't, and you don't know, once it's together, you don't know how much solder you've got between the joints. So I always make sure that I coat both sides of any pieces that are going in between that you can't get to. I coat them both sides with solder just to make sure that they are making a really nice joint when they're going to go together. So that's tinned with solder. Also, again, I would do the underside of the guide tab itself, because that's going to obviously go against that spacer. And again, this is another reason why you should always clean the faces of the chassis up first, just to make sure that all that discoloration has gone, because that way the solder will stick to it so much better. You don't need piles of solder, just make sure it's got a very thin coating like that over it. This piece here is a little bit that's going to go down through the middle. I'm not going to put any solder on that, just in case I can't get it to go back down through the middle. But I am going to put a little bit of solder on this center section as well, where the guide is going to solder on, just so everything is coated before I put the guide tab in place. So then, again, I can use some flux on top. I can put my guide tab spacer on. I can put the little peg in place. So I've assembled all those pieces. Just make sure that I put some flux around the edge, just to help the solder flow nicely. Make sure that flux is going to go down inside the little bit where the pin is, or the peg that holds it in place, like so. So that's all soldered up. And then I shouldn't really need much solder on my soldering iron, because it's got solder between each plate. So then I'm going to hold it underneath and heat that part of the chassis up, and I should be able to see solder appearing all around that area, which I can. You can always put a little bit more on if you don't think it's flowed all the way through. And there we go. Just let that cool down. Notice I'm holding it in place with a knife, just to push it all together. And then I'm going to check that the angle of the guide tab looks okay in a moment when it's cool. So if you've held it correctly, then you should be able to check the angle of the guide tab and then it's not sort of hanging down at the front. So let's just take a closer look again. Make sure solder has flowed all around there. You can see it's flowed all around the edges at the front there. And it makes a nice solid connection all the way around your guide tab. The guide tends to take quite a lot of force in accidents and so on. You don't want that coming off, because once your guide tab falls off, then obviously it's quite a bit more of a lengthy repair to get it to fix back on again and get it accurate to carry on in the race.
A few moments later.
So I've soldered a few more bits on. I haven't cleaned it up yet, but I'm going to solder these little bits here at the back of these rails. You can see these little bits here and see how they rest on this motor box here, but they're not, obviously they're supposed to move like this and they're not supposed to be soldered underneath. But I need to solder them obviously here and here either side, but I don't need to solder it to that. So the little tip I'm going to put on here is I'm going to put a little bit of oil on this surface here that's going to run underneath and stop the two bits from soldering together. So I'm going to apply the little bit of oil before I put flux on, and then I know the flux won't run where the oil is. So there we go, a little drop of oil, and then I can apply some flux like I did before, either side. Just do one at a time. And then I need to make sure that it's pushed down nicely here. So I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to make sure that is pushed down nicely before I tack it in like that with the solder. Just let it cool a moment, and then that should be nice and free to move. There we go, and it's not soldered in, and it should be pushed nicely down. I'll do the same the other side. So we can see now it's gone slightly discoloured, so I'm going to give this a bit of a clean now before it gets too bad, and I'm going to clean it all underneath. So in order to get all the solder off underneath, again I'm just going to put a bit of wet and dry paper on a block, and I'm going to rub it like this up over the wet and dry paper. I'm going to dampen it down, so I'm going to do that near the sink, but then I'll be back and you can see how it's all cleaned up nicely.
12 seconds later.
One thing to also remember, as well as cleaning the chassis, is you need to clean your building block as well. So I'll just put a little bit of water on there from sponge, like so. The water helps neutralize the acid flux, and then I'll wipe it clean with a bit of kitchen paper. So make sure it's all dry like that, and then you won't have your block covered in acid flux, and it won't go back on your chassis again. So here we have it, all cleaned up. You can see all the solder's gone from underneath. When you rub it on the wet and dry paper, it just removes all the solder from underneath and leaves you a nice flat surface. It's all the same all the way around the back there, all cleaned off. The rails move nicely, they're not soldered together. But then when I turn it over the other side, I've cleaned the top side up as well. And you can see it's all really nice and neat around there. And that's part of the beauty of soldering underneath. When you solder from the bottom, the solder flows through the joints nicely and then just goes around all the edges without putting loads and loads of excess solder on the top where you place your soldering iron. So it leaves a really nice finished job. But how do I actually get it all cleaned up on the top there? Well, I'll show you. I use some of this stuff here. It's called Toro. This comes from the Czech Republic. But basically, you can get it in other forms. It's sort of like a powder that you can mix up with water. So I take a damp toothbrush, dip it in there, so I get some powder on the toothbrush. I can then scrub it all over the chassis, and it cleans all the flux off and leaves a nice finish like that. I tend to then polish it up afterwards, because if you leave that Toro on the chassis, it can just discolour it a little bit. You can see it's starting to go a little bit there after a few minutes of cleaning. So I will tend to just run some polish over it afterwards when I'm actually finished, but it leaves a nice job. If you can't get Toro in your country, you can get something called Astonish. I'll put some links in the description. I'll show you some pictures on the screen, but it's called some different things in different countries. But it's great stuff for scrubbing the chassis once you've finished a section of soldering. Now another question you might be asking is, how do I make sure that the pillar blocks here are vertical at the back? Well, the beauty of EDM cutting is it is incredibly accurate and you get nice straight cuts through material. If it's laser cut, sometimes you get an angle on the edges of the material and it doesn't sit properly. But when you have an EDM wire cut chassis, everything sits nice and square. But if it didn't, then what I can do is I can use a ruler, so I can put my chassis on a block and I can use a ruler here or a straight edge or an engineer's square, and I can line it up like that, and I can just check visibly by eye the squareness of the pillar blocks, and if I needed to heat them up gently and move them over one way or the other, then I could. I know some people have nice little fancy jigs for doing this, so people that build chassis all the time, or they're scratch building chassis themselves, might have a little jig, and there are some really nice slot car jigs out there. So here we have the pan soldered, the bits that I've done on the pan so far. I haven't soldered the pin tubes in yet because I'm going to show you a little technique of how you can get them soldered in and aligned. But I've done everything else. I haven't done the inside pan hinge yet because, again, I need to get the height of this piece that goes through there. I need to get that correct to match up with a hinge on the center section. So again, I'll show you how I do that. So moving on to the front of the pan, here we are. I've put the little hinge in place, line my pan up where I need to. I've made sure it's pushed back into the little notch where it's supposed to be. And then I'm going to make sure that I've oiled that little joint because I don't want any solder to flow into the actual hinge part. I just want solder on this back part here. But where it sits, the hinge just falls down a little bit towards the back here. You probably can't see it from directly above. But I want the hinge to be totally level so that when the pan moves backwards and forwards, I don't get a change in height. So in order to do that, I'm just going to use a little bit of the chassis that I off-cut earlier on just to rest on that pan hinge at the front there, just to get it the height about right for that hinge. Then I can put some solder on the joint, there we are, where I'm actually going to solder. And then I can start to tack this in. Now this is a little bit more difficult to do from underneath, and to be honest, I want to do it from both sides because I want plenty of solder on this joint because I don't want it to pull out at all. So I am going to solder from above and below. So I've just run a bit of solder down there like that. And then I'm also then going to put a bit of flux underneath as well. And I'm going to apply a little bit more solder underneath. There we go. And that should keep that pan hinge nice and level. So I've scrubbed the chassis and block again, but the point I was trying to make was this little pan hinge here needs to be parallel with the bottom of the chassis so that when the pans move backwards and forwards, you don't get a change in height. But when you just rest that into those little pan stops or pan hinges at the front, normally it tended to drop down a little bit. When I design my chassis, I tend to use something that holds it here as well rather than just a slot. So I have another little hook part that fits into here that holds this end of the hinge at the right height to match the other end of the hinge. But this is a much simpler design, and it can be very quick to solder depending on how accurate you want to be. I'm sure there may be some people with some fantastic ideas of how to hold this level when it's only just pivoting about 1 point. I don't know, but my ideas seem to work and it keeps it nice and level, and that's soldered in nice and firmly, say top and bottom. You can see there is a little bit more solder than I would like around that joint, but it should make it nice and strong, and it's clear that the solder has flowed all the way through that joint. At this stage, it's also worth checking out that your chassis still sits nice and flat and that the rails in this case move equally either way and they haven't bent, because applying a bit of heat to the chassis like we've done with soldering and so on, it can sometimes cause a little twist in the chassis. But say this one's sitting nice and flat still and nothing's sort of gone out of square. So after checking the chassis is all nice and flat and straight, I've made myself a little center spine here, which is going to go between there and the center here. It's got a very slight, don't know whether you can see this if I come in closer, it's got a very slight bend in it like that, because it's going to go up and it's going to mount on that little mount at the back by the motor box and solder to the chassis here. It's about 58mm long, and that was the advice from the builder of 1mm piano wire. So I'm going to solder that on now. Now sometimes when solder cools, it shrinks slightly, and if you don't hold the chassis down like this, it can tend to maybe pull it up in the middle a little bit once you've soldered one end. So I tend to hold both ends down like this whilst I'm soldering. And then that should hopefully stop anything from wanting to pull up. And then let's just check, and then the chassis should still sit nice and flat at both ends and not have a bow in the middle. So there we have the centre spine soldered in. Now this joint at the back here sometimes is quite susceptible to breaking because there's quite a lot of force goes through these chassis. So sometimes we can wrap some wire around here or put a bit of tube over the top there just to make that joint a little bit more secure and give it sort of a mechanical link. So I haven't decided on whether I'm going to do that for sure yet. It might appear later in the video with some wire wrapped around it, but I'm going to carry on with the rest of the assembly. So next up, I'm moving on to the pin tubes. I've got some pin tube here that I've cut. They're actually from a previous chassis where I've removed them in the past. So save cutting new bits of tube, I save the old pin tubes and I can use them again if I need them. I've put them into the holes in the chassis, so I've just rested these pans in place at the moment, roughly where they're going to be. And I've put a little bit of wire through them both. Now it's not soldered in, it's just resting inside, but it helps keep the pin tubes level and straight. Now, again, I don't want to solder the wire into the pin tube by accident. So again, a little blob of lubrication. There we go. On each one, stops the wire from being soldered to them. I tend to make sure they're lined up with the outside of the chassis, and a little bit of flux around the hole. And I should be able to solder it nicely in place. There we go. Sometimes it's worth just putting a little bit more flux around just to make sure that you've got the solder to flow all the way around and underneath the hole like that, rather than just tacking the pin tube in from above, just to make sure that it's nicely soldered in like that, front and back around that pin tube. There we go. And the solder just flowed that little bit more you saw to make sure it's soldered all the way around that pin tube. So I'm going to carry on and I'm going to do the others and I'll be back. So there we have it. Pin tube soldered in, front and rear. Nice solid joint there. It even reinforces the little pin tube holder there with the solder that's flowed around the edge. I've also, cleaned up the pans again, cleaned the chassis up, cleaned the block up again. So everything's nice and clean. So there aren't many parts left now. There's only these two little bits here. There's a crossbar, and then there's these little two bits here, the inner pan hanger parts. So I'm going to finish off the center section here by putting on these little hooks towards the back here. So they hook over the main rails like this. Drop them in that slot there. There we go. Now again, I don't want to solder these to that front bit. So again, it's a case of dropping some oil in there, making sure that they're not going to stick. Then I can put some flux there on each side. Again, I'm not going to do these from underneath. I'm going to do these from the top because I can get the solder to flow nicely without putting it all over the chassis. So I'm going to do that. Then a little bit of solder on my iron. Hold it in place. Now I'm just going to push them back a little bit like that to make sure they're all the way back in the slot. Hold them in place. And then I can tack them in with the solder like that. So that's one side. If the solder hasn't quite flowed to the other side, I'm just going to put a little bit more flux on there. Obviously, I want to make sure I'm not soldering them together too much, and I could end up soldering it together. But a little bit more solder perhaps on there, and then hopefully it will flow through to the other side. Make sure it still moves. Yes, the pan bit still moves. That's nice. And then I'm going to do the one the other side. So I've cleaned up the back of those. They fit in nicely. They hook over the top like that. There is a little bit of movement, as you can see, in both of the rails. Like that. So they're moving as they should do. And they're hooked over. So the last thing I've got to do now is put the crossbar in and attach the pans. So I've radiused all the bits of the crossbar that are going to go against other parts, just rounded off the edges nicely, and the underside of the crossbar here on the outsides to make it move nicely and go into the holes nicely and reach the limits of what's needed. So I've done all of that. So I've got to try and slot it in place now. So how do I get the crossbar in through here underneath the spine for it to sit like that? Well, I thought I could wiggle it in. I thought I could get it in. You know, it sort of goes in there, but then it won't go past that lead wire retainer where I've soldered that in. So I think what I'm going to have to do is remove this lead wire retainer for now, and then I can get the crossbar in, and then I'll just solder that back in again afterwards. I could remove the spine and slide it in from the back, but I think I'm just going to remove the lead wire retainer. But maybe I should have done it in a slightly different order and not put that lead wire thingy in first. So there we are. With the lead wire retainer removed, I was able to slide the crossbar in, or the bite bar, and it now sits nicely in these two little loops at the back and the outside the pans here and here. So it's just these little bits here that I've got to put on. Again, I've rounded off all the inside edges that are important there. So now it's just a case of putting these in over the top and soldering them in. So these pieces are hooked on like that. They're all in there nicely like that. There they go. So they're sitting there. Again, I don't want to solder them to the crossbar, so I'm going to put a little bit of oil around where they go through that crossbar or that bite bar. Make sure I don't solder them to that. Just move it around, make sure the oil's in there. Then I'm going to tack them in place just on the inside edge here from above. And then I can hold that down, hold that in place, put my knife on top, and then I can just tack that in like that. Now I'm just going to tack them in because I want to just see how the pans sit and whether they sit nicely in that position before I apply all the rest of the solder and fix them in slightly more permanently. So I flip the chassis round just because it's a better angle to solder at, and I can just make sure that the chassis sits nice and flat. So I'm just going to hold the outside down and pull the inside up and just check, is there anything wobbling or is it just a bit of flex? So I'm looking just to see if there's any movement in any one of these joints here, up and down, and seeing if the crossbar sits nicely. And it looks to me like it is. So there is some chassis flex, but I'd sort of expect that anyway because the pans flex here and here. But there's no wobbling, there's no up and down movement in any of that, like that. So they are all sitting nicely. So if that's the case now, then I can start to put a little bit more solder on these joints here, and then they'll be filled in nicely. So here we have it, one finished chassis. Just giving it a little bit of a scrub. Might do with a little bit of a polish just to finish it off nicely. But you can see that I've actually added a little bit of tubing over that rear spine joint just to secure it. So I just squished a little bit of tube, pushed it on. It was nicely the right size, but we've got some nice movement. We've got the pans moving nicely like this, backwards and forth. They're not binding up with anything. The main rails are clear and free to move a little bit. There's not a lot of movement in the design, but they do move a little bit. There is one piece I haven't put on, which is this little piece here. Now, this supports the motor, Can you guess what motor it's going to take? If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up underneath. Please hit the big C. And if you really like it, if you can give me some thanks, I'd much appreciate that as well. There's a little button down below for saying thanks. Everything goes towards keeping these videos going and keeping me helping the slot racing community. So thank you once again.